robust security. Okay, so back in 2004, that was the year the .11i security amendment was ratified. Okay, so in 204, .11i amendment was ratified, which was later on it became a part of 802.11 2007 standard. Okay, you don't need to mug it up, just remember that .11i was ratified in 2004. Okay, then it was later called as the .11 2007 standard. Okay, so in 2007 standard, it defines an enterprise authentication method as well as the method for authentication for home use. So two things came out. One is the enterprise authentication method, okay, came out, and the authentication for home use authentication methods were defined. Okay, cool. So this current standard, that is 2007 standard, defines the use of an .1x authentication for and the use of pre-shared key. Basically, this particular standard defines 802.1x or EAP authentication, okay, for enterprise, and the less complex pre-shared key authentication, or I would say passphrase authentication for home authentication or small office or home office, or let's call it as SOHO, small office, home office. So that standard, this standard defines .1x to be for enterprise and PSK to be for home authentication, right? Now this standard also, basically requires the use of strong dynamic generation encryption keys. Okay, so understand this. Now this standard also talks about how we can have strong encryption keys and not static but dynamic in nature. Dynamic keys, they have to change, keep changing, they cannot have static keys. Okay, and for that to happen, CCMP encryption is the default encryption method and TKIP is the optional encryption method. So what they did was they defined as CCMP, which uses the AES algorithm. This has become the default method for encryption. Okay, and TKIP, let me just write that down again. Sorry, my pen tablet sometimes misbehaves and my handwriting also is very bad. So yeah, anyway, TKIP, which supports RC4 algorithm, this becomes the optional encryption method. Optional encryption method, right? Now this was all good. However, prior to the entire ratification of .11i amendment, this is prior to .11 ratification of .11i amendment, the Wi-Fi Alliance, what they did was they introduced something called a WPA certification. Okay, now before the ratification of .11i, let me write that down. Before the ratification of 802.11i amendment, okay, the Wi-Fi Alliance, what they did was they introduced something called a Wi-Fi protected access certification. Okay, they introduced something called a Wi-Fi protected access certification, also known as WPA. Okay, this is more like a snapshot of the not yet released .11i amendment. Okay, this was a snapshot of what is about to follow, and in this it shows that we only support, this shows that only supporting TKIP, RC4, dynamic encryption generation, TKIP or RC4. So this WPA which was introduced by Wi-Fi Alliance before the ratification of .11i, only supports TKIP encryption, dynamic key encryption, right? And .1x EAP authentication was intended for enterprise, whereas PSK was suggested for SOHO in this also. So .1x is for enterprise and PSK is for small office, home office. Okay. Now this was before ratification of .11i. Now once the ratification happened, after .11i, after 802.11i was ratified, okay, the Wi-Fi Alliance now introduced something called WPA 2, okay, certification. Okay, WPA 2 is a little more complete implementation of .11i, because now we had the entire picture of what .11i was all about. So this is a more complete implementation of .11i amendment that supports both CCMP and TKIP, not just TKIP. This supports both CCMP, AES, and TKIP RC4. Okay. Now, by the way, CCMP is the encryption method and AES is the algorithm. TKIP is the encryption method, RC4 is the algorithm of that, right? Okay. Anyway, coming back to WPA2. Now, so this is, they both support for dynamic key generation. Okay. Think of it, let me just kind of make it a little easy for you. So in WPA, okay, for home office it is called WPA personal. Okay, WPA personal basically supported WPA personal supported PSK, right, because it is for personal use, and supports TKIP encryption. WPA enterprise supports what? .1x or EAP authentication. This also supports TKIP, because if you remember in WPA it only supports TKIP. Let me just write only here, so that only supports, I'm sorry, just let me correct that. Anyway, yeah, we get the idea. So this only supports TKIP authentication. Now WPA2, when came in the picture, WPA2 personal also was PSK, right? But this supported CCMP as default, and like this is the mandatory method, and TKIP as optional. Okay. Similarly, WPA2 enterprise supports 802.1x or EAP, but it uses again CCMP as mandatory and TKIP as optional method, right? Now this is what something that you should know. Okay, I just try to make it in a form of a table so that it becomes easy for you to consume. So anyway, .1x authentication is a little more complex and meant for enterprise, and passphrase is a little simpler, so it is meant for home office, small office, home office. Now since this was made in 2004, .11i was ratified in 2004, any radio that was manufactured after 2005 most likely was WPA2 compliant, right? Any radio that was made after 2005 was WPA2 compliant. WPA2 compliant, basically that supports, that radio supports CCMP encryption. Okay, if a radio is WPA compliant, it most likely only supports TKIP. Anyway, yeah, we know that. So anything that is WPA compliant only supports TKIP with RC4 algorithm. Okay. Yeah, so I mean, this is something this is more like an introduction to what is about to follow in the next videos, but something that you should know for sure. So watch this video once again. I would say it's important to understand what WPA is, WPA2 is, why do we use .1x for enterprise, and why is PSK preferred for home, because it's less complicated. Okay, and what is .11i? So all these things you need to know. Yeah, anyway, we're gonna go to the next video and talk more about robust security networks and that, right? Okay.